Thank you so much for that nice introduction and for having me. I apologize for being late. I won't go on and on wasting further time by apologizing for wasting time. I did just want to say one thing, which is I was here maybe 5 years ago and gave a talk, which this room doesn't look familiar. I don't think it was in this room. And I talked about data that I was collecting. And I didn't have a lot to say at that time about what we would find. And so I described the study design and little else. And I'm back with some results, some kind of interesting findings. And so the format of this paper, I want to give a little bit of an overview of the project, but not much. And then I want to give you some snippets from a bunch of different papers, so as not to bore everyone with details of one, kind of crazy in-depth paper. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is the paradox of unintended pregnancy. Why do so many young women who say they don't want to get pregnant anyway? And so we know a lot about unintended pregnancy in the United States, or we know a lot in terms of descriptive and overview of unintended pregnancy. We know that a lot of pregnancies in the United States, women themselves define as having come too early or having come after they wanted no more children. We know that the rates are very high, so almost half of pregnancies in the United States, women themselves define as unintended, and this is after the pregnancy, usually after the birth, in fact. These unintended pregnancies mostly occur to women who are using contraception. More than half of these pregnancies occur to women using contraception. They're just obviously not using it well enough or not using good enough contraception. We know that these rates are up to 5 times higher for different population subgroups, including poor and minority women who have much higher rates. And we know that this is really actually a very complex idea. And so feelings about pregnancy, as anyone who's been pregnant or knows anyone who's been pregnant or been next to anyone who's been pregnant, it's very complicated. And so even women who very much were trying to get pregnant or wanted to get pregnant may also hold some not so positive feelings about those pregnancies simultaneously. And there are also a lot of different domains upon which we might be very happy or very unhappy about being pregnant. You might want a baby very much but not enjoy being pregnant. That was me. I love being pregnant, and having a baby is very, very difficult. Actually, that was true for me too. So we know quite a bit about unintended pregnancy, but there have been a lot of critiques about this concept and these measures. And so a lot of those critiques have focused on the complexity of the measure, saying this is a lot more complicated than this dichotomy or trichotomy that we measure regularly in the National Survey of Family Growth, where we ask women, before you got pregnant, did you want to get pregnant ever again? And if yes, then did you get pregnant at the right time, or was it too early, or was it too late? And if it was too early, how much too early was it? Even though that sounds a little complicated when I say it like that, actually it's much more complicated than that. And so a lot of qualitative research has focused on ambivalence and how women simultaneously hold these positive and negative feelings. And also, without necessarily using this word, I think a lot of it is focused on indifference. The sort of attitude where if it happens, it happens. I'm not actively trying to get pregnant. I'm not actively trying to avoid getting pregnant. I'm just leaving it up to fate. So a lot of the critiques have focused on that. There have been more recently social justice perspective critiques, actually some of which came out of here in the law school at Berkeley, that women tell us, poor and minority women have so much higher rates because they think they're not supposed to have babies. And so they're telling us that they didn't mean to have babies because that's what we want to hear. And so there's a lot of different critiques, a lot of them about measurement. Not very many people saying, actually, women don't feel positively or negatively about pregnancy. Some critiques have critiqued the concept itself, saying, some subgroups anyway don't plan pregnancies, period. And so I want to speak to all of those a little bit today. I don't have any answers to any of those critiques or solutions to them. I just have kind of a story that I want to tell using some data. So why do we care about pregnancy intentions? Or actually, I usually call them pregnancy desires. It makes more sense to me to refer to them as desires because we're asking women what they want, not asking women what they intend. And the word intend doesn't resonate very well with women themselves. We know that. Although, as I like to, this is my common retort to that, my mom doesn't talk about socioeconomic status either, but we don't critique the concept of socioeconomic measurement because people on the ground don't use that term. So I'm okay with the fact that we don't use the term intended or unintended. What I'm really interested in about it is motivation. And so we know that the way to get pregnant is to have sex and to not use effective contraception or not use it consistently, right? And so I want to take one step further back to a less proximate determinant of pregnancy, which is motivation. And acknowledging that access and knowledge about contraception are also important, and access to, knowledge about pregnancy itself and biology, but focusing today on motivation. And so what drives people to have sex and what drives people to use contraception if they do have sex. And I want to show you today about how desires for pregnancies play a role in both of those.
Can I just pick up on the desires and intentions?
Yes.
So in the positive, they sound kind of like synonyms, but unintended and undesired are very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
So
are they unintended and undesired?
An undesired child is something very bad. An unintended child is...
Well, look around, and lots of you were undesired children, and you turned out fine. But actually, I'm not. I think the word intentions is a funny and vague word that is kind of academic and not really, I don't relate it to a concept as easily as I do desire. But desire to avoid pregnancy and desire to become pregnant, I have clear ideas about what those things mean. Intend to become pregnant or intend to avoid becoming pregnant, to me mixes together some stuff, like desire and also steps you've maybe taken to get ready, or like maybe if you are intending to get pregnant, you've gotten an ovulation kit and you're starting to track when you ovulate, or like you're actually kind of expecting it to happen in some way. But again, I guess these are questions I can't really speak to, except for I can just spout off about them. So today I'm going to talk about desires, because that's what we asked them is, how much do you want to get pregnant and how much do you want to get pregnant? And I put all of it under the kind of the heading of motivations. So I want to talk about two parts today to this talk. First, is there really any such thing as an unintended pregnancy or an undesired pregnancy? And so do these measures mean anything? Do they behave like we think they should? Do they correlate with things like we think they should? There's a lot of problems with our retrospective measures that keep us from digging into the measures, because it's so easy to critique those correlations because they're retrospective and we think they're correlated with things that have happened in the meantime, right? So let's look at prospective measures and see, do they behave like in a way that would make sense? And then in part two, how do they predict behavior? So how are they associated with subsequent behavior? Because again, I haven't told you about this yet, but we're talking about prospective measures. So if those pregnancy desires have consequences, then the question is more interesting, I think, about whether are they real? Do they really mean something? If they're linked to behavior, then maybe. If they're not linked to behavior, then maybe not. Okay, so first, is there really any such thing as an unintended pregnancy? And here I'm using these words kind of interchangeably. Is there any such thing as pregnancies that women, can say, I did not want that pregnancy? I've certainly heard people say, demographers say, well, the costs are so high of pregnancy and the costs of preventing it are so low. If you have a pregnancy, clearly it's intended, because it would have been so easy to prevent, and the consequences of not preventing it are so big. So that's actually, some people are chuckling, but that's actually not a very uncommon statement about this whole enterprise of unintended pregnancy. Oh, it's just after the baby's born, people telling you what they think about the baby. Okay, so I want to know if women's answers to these questions make sense. And then I'm going to talk about this study that, if you're interested in the really nitty-gritty details of, I can refer you to some papers, but let me just say it's a sample of 1,003 women. They were ages 18 and 19. They were in a county, a single county in Michigan, but they were a simple random sample of women in that county. They were interviewed, there was a face-to-face 50-minute interview, after which they were interviewed weekly for 2.5 years. And we got about 2,500 relationships, and 232 pregnancies during that 2.5-year period. Someone's probably going to ask about response rates, which are really complicated with this weekly survey, so people sometimes would disappear and then come back. And so overall, I didn't get too upset if people went 13 days in between interviews. At 14 days, I started to think there was a little bit of missing data. About half of the possible interviews we could have gotten, if all women did it every 7 days, we got about half of those observations. But if everyone did their survey about every 13 days instead of every 7, that would be fine. That's not actually the case. So we had about 75% who stuck in for at least 18 months. That's the best summary of attrition that I can give you. The modal days between interviews was 8. And the median was 8 as well. The mean is a little higher because there's a big right tail.
Sorry, were you meaning that there's just a 10% chance that these pregnancies slip through? I don't understand what.
Sorry, so the women were interviewed in a baseline.
I understand that. Is it the pregnancies are in relation to them saying they want to have babies or not?
I have not gotten to that yet. So there were 232 pregnancies total. I have so many different measures of pregnancy desires. I can classify them all as unintended if I want to, because I can find some way we ask the question somewhere that will give me something not completely positive. We'll talk about that. I'll talk about that a little bit more. So about 232 pregnancies, 2,500 relationships, about 953 women who participated in the study. Okay, so we asked 2 questions about pregnancy desire. We're interviewing them every week. And we ask these questions every week. The question is, getting pregnant and having a baby is a big event. And so we're giving them this intro. We're encouraging them to give us a positive and a negative answer to the extent that we can be encouraging. One that has a lot of consequences. Most people your age have some positive and some negative feelings about getting pregnant and having a child. For this reason, we're going to ask you first how much you want to get pregnant, using a scale from 0 to 5. Then we're going to ask you how much you want to avoid getting pregnant, using a scale from 0 to 5. So actually, if you just hit the 0, 0, 0 key or the 5, 5, 5 key, because you want to get out of my survey as fast as humanly possible, you're going to be getting these super ambivalent answers or super indifferent answers, right? You're going to be at the extremes, and they're not going to match. So you're going to say, I really want to avoid being pregnant, and I really want to get pregnant if you're 5 on both measures. We don't see really any of that, hardly any. So the questions were, first, how much do you want to get pregnant during the next month? And next, how much do you want to avoid getting pregnant during the next month? And so they're asked these questions up to 130. Actually, one girl in the study did the study more frequently than every 7 days. So it came online every 5 days. And we didn't send out an invitation until the 7th day, but you can do it on the 5th day. And she did this survey 165 times. Pretty frequent. Okay, so what you might expect in this age group, this 18 and 19-year-old women, there's very, very little desire for pregnancy, and there's a strong desire to avoid pregnancy. So just on the most basic level, frequency distributions of these variables, we have 25,000 interviews with 875 young women, and the sample sizes fluctuate because the analytic samples are different in different papers. Here we're eliminating weeks where they were already pregnant, and then there's some different restrictions, but they're basically reasonable restrictions, and if you want to note them in detail, we'll have to dig up the paper. So throughout the paper, I'm going to have pronatalism at the bottom, and antinatalism at the top, so positive feelings about pregnancy going up to negative feelings about pregnancy. So desire to avoid pregnancy, that 0 to 5 scale, 5 is the strongest desire to avoid. And of all these weekly interviews, so this is at the person week level, not at the person level, 92% of those interviews were a 5 on that desire to avoid, and only 8% were anything other than a 5, spread out among the other 5 categories. And so similarly, I put this one in reverse order just so that the negatives are at the top still. And so 94% of those responses to that question about desire for pregnancy were 0. So, and then 6% were spread out over those other 5 answers. So there's very, very strong desire to avoid pregnancy in this population. and very, very little desire for pregnancy in the population. So of course the question is, who do these 6 to 8% of responses fall to? And we deal with this question in every paper because there's different levels you can conduct these analyses at. Always there's the week level, and then there's always the woman level, and in between there's the relationship level. So it was about 2,500 relationships, and I'll be working at all these levels today, sorry. Okay.
That's why we like you.
Yeah, right. So stop me though, do stop me if anything I say is confusing. I'm very happy to be stopped. So the next question is, how consistent are these desires over time? Do they change a lot over time? That 6 to 8% responses that are not antenatal, are they coming at the end of the study? Are they coming at the beginning of the study? Are women jumping all over the place? So these are group-based trajectory models, which I'm kind of in the middle of and not loving and finding them very complicated, but it's this data add in trash. We're using about 45,000 weekly interviews here with 716 young women, so they had to have some number of observations to get into this analysis, and they had to have some weeks when they're not pregnant, and so complicated sampling restrictions there. But we came up with 3 groups, and although it's a funny thing because it's almost a dichotomous variable, the 0 through 5 scale. There's so many, say, 0s or so many 5s that it's almost like a dichotomy, and so these group-based trajectory models are a little bit funky. But this part I'm very sure about. It's about 80% of women who every single time you ask them, they tell you they have 0 desire for pregnancy, which makes sense. How many 18 and 19-year-olds do you think really have a desire for pregnancy? It's 80% of them. And if I look at the desire to avoid pregnancy, it's almost exactly the same picture. And so there's this core group of more than 3/4 of them who have no desire to get pregnant. Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can get to that later.
Yeah.
If you don't, I'm curious to know what proportion of the women are married at the baseline and what proportion are married at the end?
So the question is about marriage and how many are married. Not that many are married. So is the kind of lame answer. Marriage is complicated. You think marriage is easy because you go and you apply for the marriage certificate, and then you go and you have someone officially get you married, and then you file a piece of paper. That's not always true, and in this age group, these women use that word married very loosely. So there's an article in the New York Times, probably like 4 years ago, that talked about using the word fiance very loosely, and that people were just using fiance to indicate that their relationship is serious. Especially pregnant women, will refer to their boyfriend as their fiance. These women use the word marriage like that too, even the non-pregnant women. So, we're talking to them every week, or the computer is talking to them every week. And so we start off with, last week you told us you were married to Bob. Are you still married to Bob? And she said, I was never married to Bob. I don't even know what you're talking about. So, and there's not a lot of, ways to click the wrong box in this 5-minute, click the box kind of questionnaire. And these are phone interviews sometimes, so the interviewers are clicking the boxes, and they're telling the interviewers, if they call in to do the survey over the phone, they're having a conversation with the interviewer and telling her, I don't know why you think I was married last week. I was not married last week. So 9% said they were married at the beginning of the study. There were very few marriages during the study. I actually don't really know I do know the pregnant women, the women who were pregnant when they got married when they got pregnant, stayed pregnant to the end of the study. There were like 16 married couples who had a baby, and they were still married at the end of the study period, which is a pretty short period of observation.
So the 6 to 8% that you had who had a desire to get pregnant, basically, they might be these women who were married?
Some of them might be, but so for example, while they're pregnant, they're not asked this question. And in some of these analyses, we delete the married women just because they look different. In analyses of pregnancy, usually we delete out the weeks where people wanted to get pregnant. So some of that 6 to 8% might be married people, but it's not across the board. Most of the people, the vast majority who got pregnant, were not married. 90% of the women who got pregnant were not married. That's a long answer to a simple question. Sorry. Okay, so then there's these 2 other groups. There's this group that's like, this is the mean for the group, and it's not even one. So what it's telling you is that there's like some, in each point of observation here over this age range, there's some women who are non-zero. And so basically what this is women who are kind of occasionally non-zero but never very high. And then there's this other group of women who's sort of more frequently non-zero and a little bit higher. I'm not sure how much faith I really put in these lines per se. So when I first spit it out, I thought, oh, there's a group who's kind of a medium desire and it increases over time. I'm not really seeing that if I just print out the 200 non-all-zero trajectories. They're actually kind of wonky. So, so I'm still in the middle of this. If anyone has thoughts, I'd be very happy to hear them. Okay. Then another question that you might immediately ask is how do these measures match up with each other, right? So is it the 6% of women who have some desire for pregnancy who also have less than a perfect desire to avoid pregnancy? And that might be true sometimes, but it's certainly not like there's a 6 to 8% of the women who are consistently not. We call these the 0-5 women, the 0 desire for and the 5 desire to avoid. It's not like a group of 6% who are all through, you know, the negative or the completely antenatal women. So here are some crosstabs with about 34,000 of the weekly interviews. And so when you have a 6-point scale for desire for pregnancy crossed with a 6-point scale of desire to avoid pregnancy, you get 36 cells. Those cells are not heavily populated, especially given that 80% of what I already said are this 0-5 up here, no desire for pregnancy, strongest desire to avoid pregnancy in that upper left cell. So there's not a lot of spread. So what I've done is divide this 36 squares into 4 quadrants. And so I have a pronatal quadrant down here where you're in the bottom half of desire to avoid pregnancy and the top half of desire for. And then an antenatal quadrant. So these are the 2 consistent quadrants. Like I mentioned, this is the where you have strong desire to avoid and no desire for. And then the 2 inconsistent quadrants. Here's an ambivalent quadrant where you have, you know, you're in the top half of desire to avoid and the top half of desire for pregnancy. And an indifferent quadrant where you have, like, whatever happens, happens. You don't really want to get pregnant. You don't really want to avoid getting pregnant. So how many people are in these cells? Well, those 9 cells combined in the pronatal quadrant are 2% of the observations. Ambivalence gets 2% as well. Indifferent, even less. And 94% of people fall in this, 94% of observations fall in this antenatal quadrant, and actually 91% of them fall in that square up there. So in fact, this is a little bit different than those 80% of girls who gave the same answer every week over time. 91% of the observations fall in that consistent, very antenatal category. And then we also asked, after the women became pregnant, if they became pregnant, the NSFG style question about retrospective intentions, so we could, kind of look at whether they match up or not. And so the NSFG question is, before you got pregnant, did you want to get pregnant? Did you ever want to get pregnant? Did you want to get pregnant at that time? And it gets, and so I just plunked it into an unintended versus intended, and this is hard to read, I'm sorry, but across the bottom here is positive desire for pregnancy. And again, there are different versions of this measure I could use. I could use the quadrant-based measure, but it's just a little bit harder to see this pattern. But so we're going from no desire for pregnancy up to strong desire for pregnancy. And then the bars are, this goes from 0% to 100%. The fraction who, before they got pregnant, told us this answer on the bottom. The fraction of those girls who then, after they got pregnant, called their pregnancy unintended. And it's a very pretty picture, right? So women who said they had no desire for pregnancy before they got pregnant, 90% of them told us that after they got pregnant that the pregnancy was unintended. And it goes down to 83%, 80%, 72%, and I think that's 60-some%. And then those who said they really wanted to get pregnant before they got pregnant, 53% of them called their pregnancies unintended. So, although it's a very pretty picture, it doesn't match up perfectly, right? It matches up very well here, but there's something, you know, so even women who, before they got pregnant, said they really wanted to get pregnant. So it doesn't match up perfectly. I don't think I have this analysis in this talk, but the biggest predictor of whether these women will say afterwards that their pregnancy was unintended is if they're in kind of a casual relationship with the guy. And so regardless of what they told us about how much they want to get pregnant, how much they think he wants them pregnant, being in a casual relationship is a very strong predictor of calling that pregnancy unintended, net of desires. Yes. Sorry, yes and yes.
Oh, sorry, I don't.
Oh, mine was quick, but most of these unintended pregnancies are mistimed, I'm assuming, given the age range. Or do
You would
people
be
actually say
surprised,
that?
yes.
That's what I was wondering, like, how much does that account for this variation? Are they saying,
Oh.
no, I never wanted to get pregnant?
I don't know what the difference is
Yeah.
really when you ask an 18, 19-year-old, do you ever want to get pregnant? And she says, oh God, no, I never want to have kids. Versus if you say, would now be a good time to get pregnant? She says, oh God, no, now would be a terrible time to get pregnant. I don't know. I mean, conceptually, the unwanted pregnancies that come after you have whatever. I mean, some people want 0 kids. I just don't know that you know that at 18 or 19. And I had many of the girls, and so I also did with my graduate students 72 semi-structured interviews with women from the sample, 40 with women who got pregnant. And many of them told me, I'll give you a few stories from those interviews, but many of them told me, I never wanted a baby. And here I am with 1 or 2 or, you know, so I don't know. I hate to be the person who says, well, they must have wanted a baby because they have 2, but I just don't know if I don't know what to make of that, I guess is what I'm saying. I need to dig into that a little more, Dean.
And so, this is looking at the mismatch, or the match, or
Temporal
whatever you call it,
mismatch, yeah.
pre and post reported desires, but it does look like there's, just based on the ends, and I think you told us about the distribution of intendedness, there's a really strong relationship between intentions and getting pregnant.
Absolutely. Super
Like
strong.
what % of those 5s ultimately get pregnant? It's
I'll show you. I have a
136
slide for
divided by
that.
like 500 or something,
Yeah,
right?
right. I mean, again, I have a slide with a version of that where I'll show you those 3 trajectory groups. The bottom trajectory group, where 80% of the girls are, it's like 10%. I should wait for the slide so I get the numbers right. Like 10% of them get pregnant. But if you're anything but in that super consistent, never ever, totally negative, 0 positive, if you're anywhere off that line, it's 40%. So they are very strong predictors. And it's not, you know, figuring out what to do with 130 repeated questions on how much you want to get pregnant is it's a task, right? So I've been working on that. We finished the data collection in 2012. Here we are in 2016. There have been a couple papers published, kind of basic papers with my colleague Rennie Miller, who's a psychiatrist, on how these desires for pregnancy predict pregnancy, and then we have one forthcoming also in population studies about perceptions of the partner's desire for pregnancy, and they're a good predictor also of pregnancy. Yes, they're very good predictors.
And let's hold questions to let Jennifer get through some slides.
Okay, so and then I just wanted to, this is not really a qualitative analysis. I am working on a qualitative analysis of these interviews with these women, but that is way harder than anything I've ever done before. So I've cherry-picked some pieces of their stories here, although I have read them all, and I do have impressions of those stories. These are just picked to illustrate points. So what I wanted to show you is that these young women in my study, the pregnant young women, they get what we ask when we're saying, you know, do you ever want to have kids? Are you planning to have kids? Do you want to have kids now? Do you want to wait? And so the idea that these women don't plan, don't think about planning, don't have anything to do with planning these pregnancies, in my data seems very off. And so this young woman named Samantha told me, so I asked, so do you think you'll get pregnant pretty soon? And she said, I do. I would say possibly after I finish school. He doesn't want to wait, the partner. He wants to now, you know, because we planned on moving exactly after I finish high school. We're supposed to be moving. And so she wanted to move and then time the pregnancy in relationship to the move and to school. And so the idea that she's not making plans does not make sense to me, does not ring true to me. She may not be able to implement those plans. In fact, this was a pregnancy interview, so I think this is one of the ones who had miscarried by the time I got there. There were a few who had either had abortions or miscarried right after they reported being pregnant, and by the time we got there, they were no longer pregnant. So Sarah also was talking about wantedness of this pregnancy and when it was going to happen, and she said, you know, I mean, we never actually told people, like, yeah, we're trying to get pregnant, but you know, everybody knew that. you know that we both wanted a baby. So, I mean, it was kind of say, if it happens, more or less. When it happens, you know. Not if, of course, we knew eventually we would have a kid. So clearly they want a kid, they want to have a baby at some point, they're not picky about the timing, but it's not that they're not thinking about the timing. They're thinking about the timing, and they're deciding that they're not picky about the timing. This is how I read that. And then lastly, Amber, I'm like, this is crazy, he's always excited and he wants 3. But I'm stopping at after these 2, like this 3rd one's gonna have to come from someone else. So that's a lot of planning in that sense, right? He wants 3 kids, I want 2. If you want a 3rd, you have to go somewhere else. So clearly some thinking going on there. And then, and this one I thought was interesting. A lot of women, when you ask them about their desires for babies or for pregnancy, they can't answer the question without being in relation to their partner. And so she said, he had asked me, I want to have another kid, but I wasn't right then and there, but eventually along the line or whatever. So actually translating this, he had asked me if I wanted to have another kid, and she replied, I want to have another kid, but it wasn't right then and there. And he kind of asked me, can you have a baby? And this is, I would have interpreted that to mean, like, can you ever have a baby? But she interpreted that to mean, like, can you have a baby right now? Or that's what she was telling me. Of course, I'm like, no, I'm not married. I'm already condoning sex before marriage and everything. I'm not, for God's sake, I'm not having a baby. So, so I guess I felt as I read these interviews that women were not looking at us like we were crazy, saying, I have no idea what you're talking about did I want to get pregnant? I don't control when I get pregnant. You know, I have no influence over when I get pregnant, or I don't care when I get pregnant. We did not really get that. All the people had plans. They all had plans. I'm not sure, you know, how many of them will implement those plans, but every single one of them had some plans for their life. Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to argue is that overall these measures at least make some sense, especially in reference to my particular study population. Most 18 to 22-year-old women don't desire pregnancy, and they consistently don't desire pregnancy over that period. They're consistent over time, before pregnancy. They're also consistent in terms of positive and negative desire, largely. They're consistent from before to after pregnancy, and at least they understand the concept of planning. So those are not firm answers to any of those critiques that I mentioned, but they together, to me, kind of suggest that maybe we're not talking about nothing. So how do they correlate to subsequent behavior? So they're asked frequently, and behavior is measured frequently. And so we have I have some slides on temporal ordering. If anyone's interested, I'm going to skip them in the talk part, but we can talk about them later because it's messy, especially with pregnancy. You don't know exactly when that sex occurred. And okay, so are these desires real in their consequences? And so I'm going to give you more evidence from that same study. So desire for pregnancy is associated with faster sex within relationships. This surprised me quite a lot, actually. So I was not surprised that attitudes about sex predict how quickly you have sex, or even maybe attitudes about contraception predict how quickly you have sex. But I was not expecting desire for babies to affect how quickly you would turn your relationship into a sexual relationship among these women in this age range. Many times before I had this data, I've spouted off saying, you know, these young women aren't thinking about babies when they're having sex. It's the farthest thing from their mind. But women who want to have babies can have sex faster with each given partner, or with any given partner. So this is a hazard of first sex within relationship. And so, that's the Falcon structure, and this is the temporal ordering. This is the actual model, and so we're talking about a little over 2,100 relationships, 654 women, and these measures are what's in the model. These are control variables down here. Are you highly religious? Did you have disadvantage during childhood, and did you have early sexual debut? Have you had a lot of partners? Have you already had a pregnancy? Did you have sex without contraception? But desire for pregnancy and desire to avoid pregnancy, remember these are 0 to 5 scales, so they're kind of small numbers, but it's an increase for each step you go up the scale. They're sizable effects, they're decent sized effects. Women who want to get pregnant in the upcoming month have sex with each partner faster, and women who don't want to get pregnant have sex with their partners at a slower rate. This surprised me a lot. Also, women who want large families have sex faster. Women who think children are a pain in the butt have sex slower. So a lot of different attitudes toward children and childbearing and family affect speed of sex within relationship. And so the more I've thought about this, this is the great thing about being a family demographer, right? You've done all of this stuff and you can concoct a story. So although this surprised me a lot up front, later, the more I thought about it, I think sex within a relationship is just an indicator of seriousness of that relationship, or how into that relationship you are, how much you want to take that relationship to the next level. And so I think this is really what this is telling us, is that women who want to get started on families, or want big families, or want their families soon, are ramping up their relationship seriousness a little bit faster. And this is on average too. Okay, so it doesn't surprise me at all that desire for pregnancy is strongly related to contraceptive use, but it is. And so here is just a simple table, percent using contraception consistently. I'm again going to have pronatalism from left to right. And so this is the desire to avoid pregnancy question, and this is another weak level analysis. So women who said they have 5 as a desire to avoid pregnancy, 78% of them are using consistent contraception. So the shape is what I really want to show you here, because this is just a simple graph. And there's a lot of other things that go into this 22%, right? So the fact that it's not 100% doesn't particularly surprise me, because there's a lot of other stuff going on. But the same is true for desire for pregnancy. So women who have 0 desire for pregnancy, coincidentally 78% of them are using consistent contraception as well. So that doesn't really surprise me. Desire is strongly related to pregnancy, and this, I think Josh was asking, right? Josh was asking this question. And so, and I said I have a slide for this. Oh, it's 15%. So this bottom group, this 80% of girls, which is 750 or 775 girls, only 15% of them are pregnant, which is actually quite a lot of pregnancies, right? Because it's a big, big group with a small rate. These other groups, are at 41 and 45% of them are getting pregnant, which is a much higher rate, but they're such small groups. So, and even these people are not really at the top of that desire scale. So that's what I mean when I say I can really code all of these pregnancies as undesired in some way or another. But so dramatic differences between this 15% for these girls who are on the 0 line the whole time, and really being anywhere but on that 0 line. It's over 40% of them are getting pregnant. The perception of the partner's desire is also strongly related to pregnancy. And again, this is a hazard model. And so the respondent's desire and the partner's desire are in the same model, and they both seem to have independent effects. But then I put the total desire, summed them in the model, and then checked for whether the relative desire, one was more influential than the other, and that coefficient is not significant. It's indicating that the direction is that the women's preference is slightly more important predictor of pregnancy, but it's not significant.
This is the one she's reporting his preference.
Yes, it's her perception of his preference, right. So we didn't interview men in the study. So the bad thing about that is all we have is women's perspective on these relationships. But the good thing about that is we have women's perspectives and descriptions of these relationships that you never could have found a partner for, including one-night stands and very, very casual relationships and violent relationships. So women, so it seems that these answers to these questions are linked to subsequent behavior, and then women themselves in the interviews also linked their pregnancy desires to behavior. So Alicia was telling me, her boyfriend was telling her, I don't want you to go on birth control right now. I want to get to the point of having kids, and then after that we can talk about it, talking about what type of birth control to use. Amy was talking about her pregnancy and talking about her family's reaction to her pregnancy. They're excited about the pregnancy because my aunt's like, well, it's like a sin not to have a kid before 18 on your side of the family. So they were consistently telling stories about how people want babies, and if you want babies, you have babies, and that one might be a stretch, but I like that. And this was this doesn't come up that often, but it's very striking when it comes up. We asked her, did he ever tell you that he wanted to have a baby with you? And she said, no, but I think he was just saying that. Well, he never really said it like that. He just said he don't want no more kids, and yet we're still doing it unprotectedly, and you're not pulling out or nothing, so I believe he wanted me to get pregnant. This came up a few times in the 40 pregnancies that we talked directly to the girls. Well, did he want you to get pregnant? Well, he must have, because he wasn't using condoms, so I guess so. On the other hand, did you want to get pregnant? Because you guys weren't using anything, you weren't on the pill. Oh, no, I did not want to get pregnant, I had no desire to get pregnant. They were quick to attribute their partner's lack of contraceptive use in these relatively small number of cases. Quick to attribute his lack of contraceptive behavior to desire for pregnancy, but not always their own. So overall, they predict behavior, young women, and their perceptions of their partners with any desire for pregnancy, have sex more quickly, use less contraception, and get pregnant at higher rates. So that's back to my original, simple conceptual model with the boxes and arrows. Okay, so I haven't been working on this stuff that long, although it kind of sounds long, doesn't it? If we finished collecting data in 2012. Time flies. So I don't have a lot of conclusions, and my plan is to analyze these interviews, the 72 interviews, and turn that hopefully into a longer format piece of work. I'm afraid to even say the word book, but maybe into a book, and to draw mostly on the interviews, but then bring in the data in kind of like a way that I did today, which is not like you would in a paper. So I haven't had a lot of time to sum up my thoughts on this, but one thing I have been thinking about lately is trichotomies and dichotomies. And so we prioritize one kind of dichotomy in our measure of unintended pregnancy. But actually two kinds of dichotomies. So how positive or negative you felt about the baby, and then also the timing of it. And it's almost like we believe this developmental paradigm of pregnancy desire or readiness for pregnancy that, you're not ready now, but over time you'll become ready. And so did it come at a time before you were ready? And how close did it come to the time when you were ready, as if we're all kind of marching along this path? So it just seems to me that there are a lot of different ways we can dichotomize pregnancies, and many other ways we have. Non-marital versus marital pregnancies. People are starting to work on in the NSFG, there's happiness questions. How happy were you when you found out you were pregnant? And they correlate with these kind of standard intentions measures, but not perfectly. And there's actually a really nice paper by Abigail Aiken, I can't remember where it ended up getting published, but the title of it is A Blessing I Can't Afford, and she did interviews with Latina women who told her, oh, I would be thrilled if I got pregnant, but I just can't, because I don't have the money, I'm not set up for it, I don't have the housing situation, but I would be absolutely thrilled. It would be a blessing. James Trussell has done a lot of work on contraceptive failure versus contraceptive non-use, showing that very few unintended pregnancies are contraceptive failures, and actually even when there is contraceptive failure, those women don't necessarily call those pregnancies unintended. So it just seems to me that there are a lot of different ways that you could dichotomize these, and we've only really scratched the surface, and we've really prioritized one kind of dichotomy. And so I don't know if anyone is interested in the kind of things that we are working on with the data, or that you could work on with the data. I've kind of made this 3x4 table where we're looking at pregnancy desire and sex and contraception and pregnancy as outcomes, and then the great things we have detailed measures on in terms of experiences and behavior and attitudes are relationships. So every week they're asked about a relationship, and they're asked how much time they spent together, and whether they had sex with someone else, and whether they think their partner had sex with someone else, and whether they, did I already say, spent a lot of time together, whether they agreed to only be with each other and no one else, and how much they fought. And so there's detailed measures about relationships. Because I really am rather obsessed with attitudes, there are 135-ish measures of attitudes in the baseline survey to predict subsequent behavior, which is tons of fun. And then there are all these other experiences measured weekly, like sex and contraceptive use, and then there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff in there. So if you're interested, I would love to talk to anyone more about that. That is good.
Thank you, that's incredibly rich data, and it's wonderful. One of the things that you didn't speak about at all today was abortion. And I imagine among all those attitudes, you mentioned something about abortion. I'm curious first, that among those pregnancies that occurred, what portion were aborted, but more than that, do you have some sense of what portion of the women were projecting that if they did have an unintended pregnancy, they would just be able to abort it as a substitute for this contraception that they're not effectively
That's a
using?
really good question. I was really helpful before the study that we would have excellent data on abortion because we were asking these women every week, are you pregnant? Are you pregnant? Do you think you might be pregnant? Oh, did it turn out that you are pregnant or you're not pregnant? And if you're not pregnant anymore, what happened? Did you have a miscarriage? Were you never really pregnant? Did you have an abortion? Well, we don't have any better data on abortion than anybody else. So I worked a little bit with Guttmacher to kind of try to figure out whether we had better coverage of abortion, and we don't. So and we don't have, it's not a huge number of pregnancies, and there are like 10 abortions, 10 admitted abortions. So you really would expect the abortion rate to be like 50%. So we don't have all these pregnancies for sure. Women are not telling us about pregnancies that they decide to abort. So trying to figure out what to do about this. Sometimes I just work with the pregnancies that end in a live birth. Sometimes I say I don't want to just work with the pregnancies that end in a live birth because so many people are still pregnant at the end of the study.
But did people have an intentions of using abortion as a substitute for
I
contraception?
I have attitudes toward abortion measured, but not like that. I think people don't know whether they're going to have an abortion until they're pregnant. In the semi-structured interviews, everyone talked about whether they were, that their mother wanted them to abort the baby or they thought about aborting the baby, or often what happens is, the woman calls up the partner and says, I'm pregnant, I'm going to have an abortion. And he's like, oh, no, wait. And then he talks to her I don't know if he talks her out of an abortion, this is her story after all. She decides that she doesn't want an abortion, but then he decides he does want an abortion. So often it's mixed up, and so even with a very short period of retrospection, they're not very clear. I don't think that a prospective measure would get it very well. One thing we do know is that the most unintended or the most unwanted pregnancies are the most likely to be aborted. So it's strongly related. But I don't have a great answer for your question.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I know in a lot of Paul England's work, and I'm sure other people, a big story about why there's this disconnect between, for that, I guess, middle group, where contraceptive use is inconsistent and intentions are kind of against this notion of efficacy. That people are not able to realize their intentions. It's hard to take a pill regularly, it's hard to remember many measures of efficacy.
Do I? Yeah, Paula and I have gone round and round about this, and Paula dug through the efficacy measures in here and tried to use it to predict contraceptive use, and it doesn't predict very well, and of course, much to her great annoyance. There are no questions that Paula designed that measure her concept of efficacy exactly like she would want it measured. I can tell you that that pregnancy desires are more weakly linked to pregnancy for Black women than white women. So that means that they're less, either there's more measurement error in how we're getting these measures, or they're less able to translate their intentions into behavior. I need to look at the SES interactions too, because my feeling is different than Paula's. I don't think it's self-efficacy. I think it's that there's a lot of stuff going on, and so in my sample with the girls that I personally spoke to, I felt like the thinking was, I don't want to get pregnant. I really like this guy. He wants me to get pregnant. I'm going to get pregnant. Or whatever he wants or he doesn't want, irregardless, one great way to hang on to this would be to get pregnant. Not to trap this person. That's not I wouldn't want to label it that, but this is such a great thing. Of course we want to have a baby in this relationship. I think partners have a lot to say about what's going on here, are a big piece of the story. And
but that doesn't reflect in what they say about wanting to get pregnant.
Oh no, I mean, there's lots of things that will predict pregnancy if you put them in the same model as those desires to get pregnant, right? So they're not factoring those things into their own desire necessarily, but all of those things would have independent effects. In my conceptual model, all of those things would independently affect your risk of pregnancy. You know, what else do you have to do? So, you know, a lot of people are using condoms in this sample, and wow, if you want to use condoms, you know, the failure rate's only 2% if you use a condom every single time, and you use it right. It's only 2%. You know, that's the perfect use failure rate. But in real life, it's like 20%, because it's just hard to do that every single time. Even withdrawal, the failure rate's only 5% if you do it every time and you do it exactly right. It's just, damn, that's a lot, you know, every time. So, and these are 18 and 19-year-olds, so, yeah.
So you were talking about the U.S., but I was wondering if you could talk about the difference between the U.S. and other countries, and what new insights you're getting about what makes the U.S. special. Is it our definition of intendedness, or is it our openness to having children, or is it use of contraception, or you just don't know because you're focusing on the U.S. and that's related?
I'll say two things. One, I'll spout off and say I think it's our attitude about sex. And so it's very hard to convince women, young women, to plan ahead for sex, which you really need to do if you don't want to get pregnant. You need to be planning to use some kind of contraceptive method. You know, men are not reliable withdrawers. So, and if you are not willing to admit that you want to have sex and they're planning to have sex, you can't plan ahead. It's okay for these young women if they get swept up by the moment. It's not okay to carry a condom in your purse. I do have a question about that. That makes you a slut. So there's that. We're very uptight about sex compared to most places in the world. The other thing I don't really know, I don't have a great answer for your question. So my spouting off opinion, and it was worked a little bit with John Casterline and Allison Norris at Ohio State, and they're working in Malawi, and they did an exact version of this in Malawi on a wider age range, and they got tons of ambivalence. Tons of women told them ambivalent things in their answers, which was super interesting. I was fascinated. I don't know, I mean, I think these concepts are universal, but we don't know.
So I think your slide with the few qualitative interview things are, well, I can't say worth their weight because they don't weigh anything, but
they're cool though, aren't they?
They're very cool. And you want to put them in an envelope and send them to Lant Pritchett and to everyone else, including myself, who believes in these concepts.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also have a suggestion, which may be something you've tried, but that is to construct an index of antenatal intent or something like that, that would be the desire to avoid minus the desire to have. Mm-hmm. And then you'd have a -5 to +5. Mm-hmm. And the slide you showed that had some regression results suggested, yeah, when you put one or the other in, they're equal in size and opposite in sign. That's sort of encouraging in terms of constructing an index like that.
I have done the exact model you mentioned. Boy, I'm sorry, I hate it when people do this. This is respondent and partner, but if you just pretend like this is woman's desire for and desire against, I've done that same thing. You put them in, you know, desire for and desire to avoid, you put them in at the same time, they have independent effects. If you sum them together, they have an effect that's about double that, and then you put in the, you know, which is more important, your desire to avoid or your desire for, and then what's the one that you said, which was subtract one from the other one to see sort of, I guess it's sort of like a relative strength of your desire to avoid or your desire for. And so that alone, they all predict very well. They have very similar R-squared. None of these things tell me anything except that they both seem very important.
Yeah.
They both have independent contributions. I can't seem to figure out any way to decide which one is really the thing, or, you know, and so that's interesting. interesting. I will send you that paper, Ron. I'll send it to you. You can tell me what you think and what I should do
Okay.
next. Fascinated that you would come up with that idea, so.
So this is really interesting. I had a question about sexual activity. When I'm thinking about the people being asked every week, some people in your sample are continuously sexually active in one or multiple relationships, but other people might not be having sex and they might not have had sex in a while. So I just wondered whether you've teased out some heterogeneity in what it means to say, I'm avoiding pregnancy for a person who's not sexually active versus someone who is.
Right.
And then I had a question just about how you retained people in your sample, what kind of incentives you offered. It seems like you did an
That's the
amazing job.
easy
of
question,
getting-
so I'll answer that first.
Okay.
We gave them up front, you know, SRC, the Survey Research Center at Michigan, did this survey, and they always do this. They mailed a $5 bill out up front to all our sample points. Then we hunted them down face-to-face and offered them $30 to do a 50-minute face-to-face interview. At the end of that face-to-face interview, and 93% of the women we found agreed to do it. At the end of that 50 minutes, they were invited to participate in a weekly follow-up study. 99% of them agreed to do it, or I can't remember exactly, but most of them. We paid them $5 for that first on-the-spot weekly interview. We paid them $5 for the next 3 weekly interviews to hopefully try to, you know, up front load some of the incentives. Then we paid them $1 per week, and if they did 5 in a row on time, which is within 10 days, we gave them a $5 bonus. So up to $2 a week for the rest of the study. One thing I think was really cool is we loaded the incentives on a debit card. So we just transferred the money in, they could call a number, get the balance. These are girls without a lot of, many of them are girls without a lot of money. They'd love to having this credit card, made them very happy. We bugged them if they didn't do their weekly surveys. We called them, we bugged them until they said, do not ever talk to me again. We continued to bug them, and that's hard. Most of them don't ever do that, like this banker who keeps calling me. I'm like, oh, I'm really busy right now. Yeah. So he keeps calling me back, and I'm thinking I have to be like those interviewers, you know, they do not go away until you say, do not ever call me again. And so we just kept bugging them, and and so this gets to your other question as well. I think this was your question. It's hard to keep women in the study who don't have any of this stuff going on. So were you interested in how the questions would affect people each week, or were you interested in patterns of sex? My French colleague, Caroline Moreau, is like, oh, so depressed by this data because there's only sex in about 50% of weeks. She's like, they're 18 and 19-year-old girls, how can they not be having more sex than this? And so let me spot off about sex for a while, or not, I'll just give you some results about sex. In all the relationships, about a third have sex in the first week. About a third never have sex that either end, or we run out of time observing them. And about a third have sex in the middle, but that rate looks like this. So it's very front-loaded as well in that middle period also. As for how these people like being asked these questions every week, Chris Backrack said, oh, you know, why don't you have one open-ended question at the end, is there anything else you want to tell us? And we got fascinating things in these, I don't know why we call them the Q ones. People told us things like, I got my nipples pierced this week. People told us things like, I got an A on my math test. On the not funny extreme, people told us things like, I don't have enough money for food this week, which prompted us to send out some information about social services in that county. Some things they said were, I'm a lesbian, and these questions are really obnoxious because they don't apply to me. Some things they said were, I don't have a boyfriend, why do you keep asking me about sex?
Yeah.
You know, although we didn't ask them about sex if they said they had no partner. So there's a screener, and this was, I think, crucial also to keeping them in the study. We had a very well-designed questionnaire, if I don't mind saying so myself. There's no questions that would have annoyed me, so they always start off with, you know, are you still in the same situation? And if so, we don't re-ask you. Do you still have this partner? If so, we don't ask you again how old he is or how much school he got, or, you know, whether he's black or white. And then if you don't have, and so we try to get every possible kind of partner. Do you have any partner in the past week who you either had physical contact or emotional contact or blah, blah, blah? If there's nothing, We don't ask them if they had sex. If they didn't have sex, we don't ask them about contraceptive use, except non-coital methods we do ask about, because some women take those for acne or for bleeding control. So we tried really hard to keep the questions very, very tailored. And yet, I do think, so we found, I have a whole paper analyzing the attrition in the weekly survey. One thing we found was that women who got pregnant did not leave the study any more than other women. They did seem to have a delay in their, in how frequently they would complete their surveys after the pregnancy, but they did not leave. Women who didn't have anything going on maybe left at a slightly higher rate. So women who never had a partner, never got pregnant, didn't have much to tell us, and then also minority women, underrepresented minority women did leave the study a little bit faster. So in all of that, did I answer your question somewhere?
This is
Be out of time?
This is not a study I would ever like to leave. Unfortunately, attrition must now rise.
Yes,
So
everyone a trip. Yes.